When a billionaire father overhears a waitress's quiet truth about his disabled son, shatters his world, and forces him to choose what truly matters before it's too late. David Lawson was the kind of man newspapers loved to write about. His face often appeared on the covers of business magazines, with bold headlines praising his intelligence, determination, and unmatched success in the corporate world. People saw him as an inspiration, a man who had built an empire from nothing. But behind all the shiny photographs and smiling interviews, there was another side to David's life, a side few people ever saw. At 51 years old, David had everything most people could only dream of: a massive fortune, luxury cars, a penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline, and vacation homes in 3 different countries. Yet despite all of this, there was one thing he didn't have enough of: time. His days were scheduled down to the minute, packed with board meetings, conference calls, business lunches, and endless emails. Time seemed like an enemy he could never control, no matter how powerful or wealthy he became. David's greatest treasure wasn't in his bank account. It was his son, Ethan. Ethan was 12 years old, with sandy brown hair and a pair of deep blue eyes that seemed to notice everything. He was smart, kind, and curious about the world, but life hadn't been easy for him. Born with a rare condition that made walking difficult, Ethan had relied on a wheelchair for most of his life. Though he had learned to move with the help of crutches for short distances, every step was a challenge. David loved his son deeply, but the truth was, he hadn't been there as much as he wanted to be. Work always got in the way. Birthdays had been celebrated late because of urgent business trips. School events were often missed because of important meetings. Even the small moments, breakfast together, helping with homework. Bedtime stories were rare. Ethan never complained, at least not in words. But David could feel the distance between them growing. There were times when he caught Ethan looking at him with a quiet expression, not angry, not upset, just distant. That was the worst kind of pain for David because he knew it came from years of absence. One rainy Thursday afternoon, something unusual happened. David had just finished a tense meeting that had ended earlier than expected. As his driver pulled up to take him to the next appointment, David paused. He remembered that Ethan's physical therapy session was happening that day. Normally, the family's assistant would handle pick-up and drop-off, but today, David felt an urge to go himself. It wasn't planned, and for a man like David, whose life revolved around plans, that was rare. Told his driver to head straight to the therapy center instead of the office. As they drove through the gray city streets, raindrops streaking the car windows, David realized how long it had been since he had done something spontaneous for Ethan. When he arrived, he found Ethan in the therapy room, working hard with his trainer. Sweat glistened on the boy's forehead as he concentrated on taking careful, deliberate steps with the help of his crutches. Every movement looked like it took enormous effort, yet Ethan didn't give up. Watching from the doorway, David felt a swell of pride and guilt. Pride because his son was stronger and braver than he'd ever imagined. Guilt because he hadn't been there to witness most of these small but important victories. When the session ended, Ethan looked up in surprise to see his father waiting. "Dad?" he asked, a little breathless. "What are you doing here?" "I thought I'd pick you up today," David said with a smile. "If you're not too tired, maybe we could get some lunch together." Ethan's eyes lit up just a little. "Sure," he said. They walked slowly to the car, Ethan leaning on his crutches. David made sure to match his pace. The driver held an umbrella over them, but David barely noticed the rain. His attention was on Ethan, who was telling him about the exercises he had done that day. David listened carefully, trying to remember every detail. Instead of taking Ethan to one of his usual high-end restaurants, David suggested they try a small diner near the therapy center. He had passed it many times before, but never gone inside. The building was nothing fancy, just a cozy little place with big windows, fogged from the steam of hot food and the dampness outside. It smelled faintly of coffee and freshly baked bread. Inside, the warm air wrapped around them, carrying the sound of quiet chatter and the clinking of cutlery. A waitress in her 20s greeted them with a bright smile and led them to a corner booth. David chose the booth deliberately, wanting to give Ethan privacy from the rest of the room. The menu was simple, filled with burgers, sandwiches, soups, and pies. Ethan studied it carefully, his fingers running along the laminated pages. David noticed how his son glanced around now and then, as if worried about people watching him. Crowds sometimes made Ethan uncomfortable, especially when strangers stared at his crutches or wheelchair. The waitress returned, introducing herself as Lily. She had a friendly, down-to-earth way about her, the kind that made people feel instantly at ease. She took their order without rushing them, chatting lightly about the weather and the diner's homemade pie. David found himself relaxing. There was something comforting about the small diner, the rain tapping against the windows. The smell of coffee, the warm glow from the hanging lights. It was a stark contrast to the cold, polished boardrooms he was used to. He noticed that Ethan seemed a little more at ease, too, leaning back in his seat and glancing out the window as if enjoying the quiet moment, when Lily brought their drinks. She placed David's coffee in front of him and then leaned down slightly, toward Ethan. Her voice dropped to a whisper. And though David couldn't hear the words, he saw Ethan's expression change, a small, hesitant smile mixed with something softer, almost sad. She gave his shoulder a gentle pat before straightening up and heading back toward the counter. David's brow furrowed slightly. It was such a small exchange, but it stirred something in him, a mix of curiosity and an unexplainable unease. What had she said to his son? Why did Ethan look different now? For a few seconds, David considered asking right then, but he decided to wait. Didn't want to ruin the moment or make Ethan feel uncomfortable. Instead, he took a sip of his coffee and tried to focus on their lunch, but deep down, he knew something had shifted, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it as they waited for their food. David asked Ethan about school, his friends, and his favorite books lately. Ethan answered politely, but David noticed. He was quieter than usual, his eyes occasionally drifting toward the counter where Lily was serving another table. David's mind wandered back to the whisper. He told himself it was probably nothing. Maybe she had just said something encouraging, like "You're doing great" or "That's a nice shirt." But there was something in Ethan's eyes that didn't feel like the result of a simple compliment. It felt deeper, heavier, and though David didn't yet know it, that one quiet moment between a waitress and his son would soon change everything, not just for that afternoon, but for the way he saw himself as a father and the choices he would make for the rest of his life. I can continue with part 2 in the same style when you're ready, keeping it simple, emotional, and realistic. That's where the quiet exchange between Ethan and the waitress begins to carry more weight. The small diner felt warmer than the rainy streets outside, almost like stepping into another world. The large windows were fogged from the steam of hot soup and freshly brewed coffee, and the air smelled faintly of buttered toast and cinnamon. It wasn't the kind of place David Lawson usually went to, but today he didn't care about fine dining or expensive menus. He cared about something else: time with his son. They had taken a booth in the corner, away from the crowd. It was a quiet spot where they could see most of the room without being too visible themselves. David liked it because it felt private. Ethan liked it because it meant fewer people would notice his crutches. The leather seats were a little worn, the table had a few scratches, but it felt real and comfortable. David sat across from Ethan. Watching him study the menu, Ethan's fingers traced the words slowly, his blue eyes scanning the list of sandwiches, burgers, and pies. He didn't seem to be in a rush to decide. David wondered if his son was reading every detail or just enjoying the rare moment when they were together like this. The waitress returned. A young woman with a kind face and hair pulled back into a messy bun. Her name tag said Lily. She had a warm smile, the kind that made people feel like she was genuinely happy to see them. David noticed that when she looked at Ethan, her smile softened even more, like she was talking to an old friend rather than a stranger. "Hey there," she said gently, placing 2 menus on the table. "What can I get you both to drink while you decide?" David ordered coffee for himself, and Ethan asked for a chocolate milkshake. "Good choice," Lily said. To Ethan, her voice light and friendly. "Ours are the best in town." She winked, making Ethan smile just a little. She left to get their drinks, and David leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So," he said, "how was therapy today?" "We saw you working hard when I came in." Ethan shrugged. "Well, it's okay. I'm trying a new balance exercise. It's harder, but the trainer says I'm getting stronger." David nodded. "I could see that. You've gotten better at moving with the crutches. Your pace is faster than the last time I saw." Ethan looked at him for a moment, then glanced away. "Haven't seen me in a while." The words weren't sharp or angry, just matter-of-fact, but they landed heavily in David's chest. Before he could think of how to respond, Lily returned with their drinks. She set the coffee in front of David and the milkshake in front of Ethan. Then something unexpected happened. She leaned down slightly, so she was at Ethan's eye level, and her voice dropped to a whisper. David couldn't hear what she said, but he saw Ethan's face change. At first, his son's eyes widened slightly, then a small, shy smile appeared. But there was something else there too, a faint sadness that David couldn't ignore. Lily gave Ethan's shoulder a gentle pat, straightened up, and walked away without looking back. David sat still for a moment, his coffee untouched. The whole exchange had lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it left him with an odd feeling, a mix of curiosity, confusion, and a strange unease. What could she have said that made Ethan react like that? He glanced at his son. Ethan was looking down at his milkshake, stirring it slowly with the straw.
Ow.
David considered asking about the whisper right then, but something told him to wait. He didn't want to put Ethan on the spot in the middle of the diner. "Looks good, huh?" David said, nodding toward the milkshake. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it's thick. Just how I like it." David tried to steer the conversation toward lighter topics: school, books, video games, but he noticed that Ethan's mind seemed to wander. Every now and then, his eyes would drift toward the counter where Lily was working, delivering plates to customers and chatting with the cook. It was clear that whatever she had whispered had stayed with him. Their food arrived a few minutes later: a cheeseburger and fries for David, grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup for Ethan. The plates were simple, but the smell made David realize how hungry he was. He picked up his burger, but his thoughts kept returning to that moment between Ethan and Lily. There was something about the way Lily had looked at Ethan. It wasn't pity. Exactly. It was more like recognition, as if she understood something about him that others didn't. David kept stealing glances at her as they ate. She moved quickly between tables, always smiling, always polite. She seemed to notice every little thing: a customer needing a refill, a child struggling to cut their food, an elderly man searching for his glasses. There was kindness in the way she worked, but also a quiet sadness in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. Meanwhile, Ethan ate slowly, dipping his sandwich into the soup. He seemed to enjoy the meal, but there was still that thoughtful look on his face. Every now and then, he'd glance up at David as if he wanted to say something, then stop himself. David decided not to push. Instead, he tried to make the moment feel easy and relaxed. They talked about a movie Ethan wanted to see, about the dog one of his classmates had just adopted, about the weather and how much Ethan hated the rain. But even as they chatted, the whisper hung in the air between them, unspoken but impossible to ignore. When they finished eating, Lily came by to clear the plates. She smiled at David politely, but when her eyes met Ethan's, the smile softened again in that same special way. "You let me know if you need anything else, okay?" she said to him, her voice gentle. Ethan nodded, and David noticed the faintest blush in his son's cheeks. As they left the diner, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The driver opened the car door, and David helped Ethan inside. But before climbing in himself, he glanced back at the diner through the window. Lily was serving another table, laughing at something a customer said. She looked completely ordinary, yet something about her felt important. The ride home was quiet at first. The city lights blurred against the wet windows, and the sound of rain filled the silence. Finally, David said, "You seem to like the waitress." Ethan's eyes stayed on the window. "She's nice." David waited for more, but Ethan didn't say anything else. Whatever had passed between them in that quiet whisper, it wasn't something his son was ready to share. Not yet. But David couldn't stop thinking about it. He had no idea that the answer to that small mystery would soon shake him in ways he didn't expect, forcing him to face truths he had been avoiding for far too long. The ride home from the diner was quiet, but it wasn't the comfortable kind of silence. It was the kind that felt heavy, like there was something unspoken hanging in the air. David kept glancing at his son, hoping Ethan would start talking about whatever the waitress had whispered to him. But Ethan's gaze stayed fixed on the rain-streaked window, his thoughts clearly somewhere far away. David tried to start small conversations about school, about the movie they had talked about, earlier about the dog that one of Ethan's friends had just adopted. Ethan answered politely, but there was no spark in his voice. Something was on his mind. David was beginning to think he already knew what it was. When they arrived home, the driver helped Ethan out of the car while David followed slowly. He felt an odd tightness in his chest, a mix of curiosity and a strange fear. He wasn't used to feeling nervous around his son, but right now, he was. Inside. The warmth of their home did little to ease David's unease. He hung up his coat and followed Ethan into the living room, where his son sank into the couch, resting his crutches beside him. David took the chair opposite him, leaning forward. "You've been quiet," David said gently. "Is everything okay?" Ethan shrugged without looking at him. "Yeah," David hesitated. "Is it about the waitress?" This time, Ethan's eyes flicked up to meet his, and then back down again. He didn't answer right away, and the pause made David's heart beat a little faster. "I saw her whisper to you," David continued, keeping his tone light but careful. "I couldn't hear what she said, but you looked different after that. I just want to know what she told you." Ethan's fingers played with the seam of a cushion. For a moment it looked like he might not answer at all. Then, in a voice so quiet that David had to lean forward to hear, Ethan said, "She said, she's sorry I have to grow up thinking. My dad doesn't have time for me." The words landed like a punch. David froze, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe something kind, maybe a simple compliment. But not this, not something that cut so deeply. He stared at his son, who still wouldn't look at him. "She said that?" David asked, his voice almost a whisper now. Ethan nodded, still staring at his hands. "Yeah." For a long moment, David couldn't speak. The words echoed in his mind, mixing with memories he had tried to push away. Missed birthdays, canceled plans, unanswered calls while he was in meetings. Promises to make it up later that somehow never happened. It hurt even more because, deep down, he knew Lily's words weren't entirely wrong. Ethan had never shouted at him or told him he was angry. Instead, he had learned to accept the absences, to smile politely when David finally showed up after weeks of barely seeing him. That quiet acceptance was worse than anger. It meant Ethan had stopped expecting more. David swallowed hard. "Is that what you think?" he asked carefully. "Do you think I don't have time for you?" Ethan finally looked up, his blue eyes meeting David's. They were calm, but there was a weight in them that a 12-year-old shouldn't carry. "Sometimes," he said, "I know you're busy. I know your work is important, but sometimes it feels like you're always somewhere else." David's heart twisted. He wanted to explain that he worked so hard for Ethan, to give him the best life possible. But the words felt hollow even in his own mind. What was the point of giving his son everything if he wasn't there to share it with him? He leaned back, feeling suddenly drained. The house around him seemed too big, too quiet. The ticking of the clock on the wall felt loud in the silence. Between them, "Ethan," he began slowly, "I'm sorry. I didn't realize. I knew I worked a lot, but I didn't think it made you feel like..." His voice trailed off. There was no good way to finish that sentence. Ethan didn't reply right away. He just looked down again, his small hands fiddling with the edge of his sweater. David wanted to reach across the space between them and hold him. But something held him back. Guilt, maybe. Or the fear that his son might pull away. The waitress's face flashed in his mind again, the way she had bent down to speak to Ethan, the softness in her eyes, the quiet certainty in her expression. She hadn't said those words to hurt David. She had said them because she had seen something, and the worst part? She was right. David spent the rest of the evening moving through the house like a shadow, playing the moment in the diner over and over in his mind. He thought about all the times he had chosen work over Ethan, telling himself it was temporary, that there would be more time later. But later never came. After dinner, he stood in the doorway of Ethan's bedroom, watching his son read a book in bed. The soft glow of the lamp lit up his face, and David saw how small and young he still was, and how fast that would change. Childhood didn't last forever, and once it was gone, you couldn't get it back. That night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep, David sat alone in his office. The room was lined with shelves of books, framed awards, and photographs from business events. But the photo that caught his eye wasn't from a gala or a boardroom. It was a picture of Ethan at age 6, sitting on David's shoulders, both of them laughing. It had been taken on one of the rare days David had taken off work to spend with him. He picked up the frame and stared at it, feeling a lump in his throat. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that giving Ethan financial security was the same as giving him love. But money couldn't replace time, couldn't replace presence. The waitress had seen something that David had been too blind, or maybe too afraid to see, and she had said it out loud, not to shame him, but to wake him up in the quiet of that late hour. David realized something with absolute clarity. If he didn't change now, he might lose the chance to truly know his son. No amount of wealth could ever buy that back. The next morning, David woke earlier than usual. He had barely slept, his mind replaying Ethan's quiet words over and over. The house was still, the only sound the faint hum of the heating system. Normally, his mornings began with a quick breakfast and a rush out the door to meetings. But today, the thought of sitting in another boardroom made him feel sick. He poured himself a cup of coffee, but barely touched it. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling from the mug, thinking about the diner, the whisper, and the look in Ethan's eyes when he'd said, "Sometimes it feels like you're always somewhere else." Those words had lodged themselves deep inside him, impossible to shake. He remembered the waitress Lily. Her expression when she leaned down to talk to Ethan hadn't been one of pity. It had been one of recognition, as if she understood something about his son that even David didn't, and she hadn't been afraid to say it out loud. Even though she must have known it could upset him, David had never been the type to confront strangers about personal matters. But the more he thought about it, the more he knew he couldn't just let it go. He needed to hear from her directly to understand why she had said those words. By mid-morning, he found himself back in his car, telling his driver to head toward the diner. The rain from yesterday had cleared, leaving the streets slick and glistening under a pale winter sun. The city was alive with its usual chaos: honking cars, rushing pedestrians, the smell of roasted chestnuts from street vendors. But David barely noticed any of it. When they reached the diner, it was quieter than it had been the day before. The morning rush was over, and only a few customers sat scattered at tables, sipping coffee or eating late breakfasts. The bell above the door jingled softly as David stepped inside. Lily was at the counter, writing something on a notepad. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral but polite. "Good morning," she said. "Back for another coffee?" David hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about yesterday." Her pen stilled over the paper. "Yesterday?" "Yes, when you spoke to my son." He kept his voice calm, but there was a seriousness in his tone. "You whispered something to him. He told me what you said." Lily set the pen down and folded her arms lightly, her expression cautious but not defensive. "And what did he tell?" "You," I said. "That you're sorry he has to grow up thinking his dad doesn't have time for him." There was a pause. The sound of a fork clinking on a plate somewhere in the background filled the silence. Finally, Lily nodded slowly. "That's right, I did say that." David studied her face. "Why, you don't know me? You don't know my life, or how much? I care about my son." She didn't flinch under his gaze. "You're right, I don't know you. But I know the look in your boy's eyes. I've seen it before." Something in her voice made him pause. It wasn't harsh, but it carried a quiet weight. "Seen it where?" he asked. "At my brother," she said simply. She gestured toward an empty booth, and after a moment, David followed her there. She sat across from him, resting her hands on the table. Her voice softened as she began to speak. "My younger brother, Aaron, was born with cerebral palsy. He couldn't walk without help, and he needed a lot of care. Mom was there for him every day, but our dad, who was always working, said it was to pay for Aaron's treatments, to make sure we had everything we needed. Dan, maybe that was true, but it meant he was never around. He missed school plays, birthdays, hospital visits. He missed everything that mattered to Aaron. David listened quietly. It's the image of a boy who wasn't much different from Ethan forming in his mind. I used to watch my brother sit by the window in the evenings. Lily continued, her voice trembling slightly. He'd wait for Dad's car to pull up. Some nights he waited for hours, even though deep down he knew Dad wasn't coming. Eventually, he stopped waiting. He stopped asking when Dad would be home. That was the worst part, watching him give up. Her eyes glistened for a moment. Before she blinked the tears away, "When I saw your son yesterday, I saw that same look in his eyes. Not anger, not disappointment. It was quiet acceptance. Like he's already learned not to expect you to be there." David's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to explain that his life was different, that his work was for Ethan's sake. But the words felt empty, even in his own mind. "I didn't say what I said to hurt you," Lily went on. "I said it because I wish someone had said it to my dad before it was too late." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The hum of the coffee machine filled the silence, along with the faint clatter of dishes in the kitchen. David finally found his voice. "Do you think it's already too late for me?" Lily shook her head. "No. Your son still looks at you. Like he wants you there. That means you still have time. But you have to decide what matters most before that look changes, because once it does, you can't get it back." Her words settled over him like a heavy blanket. He thought about all the deals he had chased, the hours he had spent in boardrooms instead of playgrounds, the trips he had taken that didn't include his son. None of it seemed worth it if it meant losing Ethan's trust. When he left the diner, the air outside felt colder than before, or maybe it was just the way his thoughts weighed on him. He got into the car and sat in silence, staring out the window as the city moved around him. On the drive home, he thought about the photo in his office, Ethan on his shoulders, both of them laughing. He thought about the times Ethan had asked if he could come to the office with him, and how often David had said no because it would be boring or too busy. He thought about the missed therapy sessions, the school concerts he had sent. Flowers too, instead of showing up in person. By the time they pulled into the driveway, David knew something had to change. He couldn't keep telling himself he would make more time later. Later had already stolen too many years. Inside, he found Ethan in the living room, building something with Lego bricks. David sat down on the floor next to him without saying a word. Ethan glanced at him in surprise, then smiled faintly. They worked together in silence, and for the first time in a long while, David felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He didn't tell Ethan about his conversation with Lily. Not yet. But her words stayed with him, like an echo he couldn't ignore. He knew they weren't just a warning. They were a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. That night, David sat on the edge of his bed long after the house had gone quiet. The lights in the hallway were off, and through the open door he could see the faint glow of the nightlight in Ethan's room. He thought about what Lily had told him in the diner earlier that day, about her brother, about the look she had seen in Ethan's eyes, about how once that look changed, you could never get it back. He had spent most of his adult life believing that providing for his son meant giving him the best education, the safest home, the best doctors, and the kind of financial security most people could only dream of. But now he understood something he had ignored for too long. None of that mattered if he wasn't truly present. The next morning, David woke up with a clear decision in his mind. He called his assistant and told her to cancel his upcoming overseas business trip, something he had never done before without an emergency. She was surprised, even a little alarmed, but he didn't explain. This wasn't about business. This was about something far more important. When Ethan came into the kitchen that morning, he was still rubbing his eyes and yawning. He stopped when he saw his father sitting at the table with 2 plates of pancakes, a bottle of syrup, and 2 glasses of orange juice. "What's this?" Ethan asked. "Breakfast," David said simply. "With me? Thought we could eat together before your therapy session?" Ethan blinked, as if trying to decide whether this was real. Slowly, he sat down. "You're not going to work?" "Not today," David said. "Today, I'm going with you to therapy, and tomorrow, and the day after that." Ethan gave a small smile, but he didn't say anything. David knew his son was probably thinking it was just for a day or two, and then things would go back to normal. But he was determined to prove otherwise. Over the next weeks, David changed his schedule in ways no one in his company had ever seen. Before, meetings were moved, flights were postponed, and instead of rushing from one office to another, David was at Ethan's therapy sessions, cheering him on. He learned the names of Ethan's trainers, sat beside him as he practiced walking, and clapped for every small improvement. He started picking Ethan up from school at least twice a week, and sometimes they would stop for ice cream or take a slow walk in the park. They played board games in the evenings, watched movies, and even tried cooking dinner together, though that ended with a slightly burned lasagna and a lot of laughter at first. Ethan seemed unsure about the change, as if waiting for his father to get too busy again. But as the days turned into weeks, his guard slowly began to drop. The smiles came easier. The conversations grew longer. When Ethan laughed, it wasn't the polite laugh David had heard so often before. It was the kind of laugh that came from feeling safe, from feeling loved. One Saturday afternoon, about 3 months after that rainy day in the diner, David and Ethan were sitting in the living room, building a model airplane, when David said, "How about lunch out today?" "Where?" Ethan asked. "I was thinking the diner." Ethan's eyes lit up in recognition. "Where Lily works." David nodded. Exactly. When they arrived, the diner was busier than the last time. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped in, and the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon wrapped around them. Lily was at the far end, serving a family, but when she saw them, her eyes widened slightly. She smiled. A real smile that reached her eyes, and waved them toward a booth. "I didn't think I'd see you two again," she said when she came over with menus. "We've been busy," David replied, then corrected himself. "Busy spending time together." Lily glanced at Ethan, who was already studying the menu. "That's good to hear." They ordered milkshake for Ethan, coffee for David, and burgers for both. And as Lily walked away, Ethan leaned forward. "Are you going to tell her?" David pretended not to understand. "Tell her what?" "That you've been coming to therapy with me, and you're home more, and you haven't gone on those long trips?" That she kind of started it. David smiled. "I think she already knows." When their food came, they ate slowly, talking and laughing. It felt easy, natural, the kind of meal David wished they had been having for years. When they finished, and Lily came to clear the plates, David looked at her seriously. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "For what?" She asked, puzzled. "For being honest with my son that day? For saying something I needed to hear, even though you didn't know me? You made me realize I was losing the most important person in my life without even seeing it. And because of you, I changed." Lily's eyes softened. She glanced at Ethan, who was watching quietly. "You did the hard part," she said. "You listened." After paying, David stood up, but before they left, Ethan said to Lily, "Thanks for saying what you said that day. I think it made my dad see me better." Lily smiled at him and nodded. "You're a lucky kid," she said softly. "Not because your dad's rich, but because he listened in time." The words stayed with David as they walked out into the sunshine. He realized she was right. He had listened, but only because someone had cared enough to speak up. From that day on, the diner became something of a tradition for them. Every couple of weeks, they'd stop by for lunch, and Lily would greet them with the same warm smile. Sometimes she'd join them for a quick chat between tables, and David always felt a quiet gratitude toward her. Months passed, and the bond between father and son grew stronger. David still worked. He had to, but he never let his schedule push Ethan to the sidelines again. Business deals could wait. His son could not. One evening, almost a year after that rainy afternoon, David was tucking Ethan into bed. The boy was taller now, his crutches a little too short for him. There was a new confidence in the way he carried himself. "Dad?" Ethan said sleepily. "Yeah, I don't think you're always somewhere else anymore." David felt a lump in his throat. He leaned down and kissed the top of his son's head. "Good," he whispered, "because I'm exactly where I want to be." As he turned off the light and walked out of the room, he thought about all the wealth he had accumulated over the years. None of it compared to this, to being here, to being part of his son's life in a way that truly mattered. And in his heart, he knew that thanks to one quiet whisper from a stranger in a diner, he was richer now than he had ever been.